Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Meantime, in Congress, House Republicans are pulling together a tax bill. And what's notable this week is a handful of their Republican colleagues are saying that they're going to block this unless it includes a provision to increase the federal deduction for state and local taxes paid. And before we get to that, Monet, I wonder if you can just tell us a little bit about what is in this tax bill that the House Republican majority is interested in getting passed.
Well, the House Ways and Means Committee introduced this tax bill in June, sort of coming right off of the debt ceiling increase, which they saw as a victory for some of their fiscal priorities. They wanted to show Americans how they'd be able to reform the tax system. Obviously, with Democrats in control of the presidency and the Senate, it's unlikely that it's going to pass in its exact current form, the way that Republicans drew it up, but they hope that it can display what their agenda is. And you could divide it into two parts. So one has to do with business taxes. It would extend provisions of the 2017 Republican tax reform that had expired or started to expire. One of those provisions is full expensing for capital investments that businesses make. So things like equipment, trucks, any sort of temporary capital spend, so not buildings, but depreciating capital. They want businesses to be able to immediately deduct the full cost of that equipment from their income statement on their next tax bill. Whereas today, they're able to deduct only 80% of it, and it's slated to decrease by an additional 20% in each coming year. And that adds a big cost to businesses, especially capital-intensive ones like manufacturers. Another one of the provisions they wanted to extend was the full immediate deduction for research and development. So businesses previously have been able to deduct any research that they do into their product lines from their next tax bill. But as of 2021, they've only been able to deduct it over 5 years for domestic research or 15 years for international research. And so the Republican tax bill would reinstate that full immediate deduction. And then in addition to that, you do have personal income tax changes. They want to increase the standard deduction for individual filers. So whenever anyone's filing a tax bill, if they choose not to itemize and instead want to claim the standard deduction, they would get $2,000 additional dollars filing individually or $4,000 additional dollars as a household that they could deduct from their income statement on their next tax bill. So you see different kinds of tax relief for businesses and individuals, but basically the aim of the bill is to relieve the tax burden on Americans.
And the debate over the SALT deduction, the state and local tax deduction, has been going on for years now. As a reminder of how that works, if you're a citizen of a state with high taxes, you pay a certain amount in state and local taxes, you can deduct that on your federal return. And it used to be unlimited, if I recall. The 2017 Trump tax reform capped that at $10,000. And ever since that, people in these big blue states, even if they're Republicans, have been arguing to raise that cap or to expand it. And I was struck by a quote from Mike Garcia. He is a Republican congressman around LA. And this is from the Journal's news story on this. And he says that anybody in his district who has a house and has a job is over that $10,000 cap. And then he says that leaving it at $10,000 would be, quote, a continuation of this middle finger mentality, unquote, toward his constituents. And Kim, the problem with that argument is, to my mind, the middle finger is coming from Sacramento. That's where those taxes on people living in LA at the state level are being set. And it makes no sense to give a tax break to Californians, which is ultimately made up and subsidized by taxpayers in other states, just because they live in a state with dysfunctional politics where tax rates are through the roof.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the middle finger coming from Sacramento and from Albany, New York, and from Trenton, New Jersey. Look, these guys are essentially advocating for poor tax policy, Democratic tax policy, because what they want to do, and this is why everybody likes the SALT deduction, is that it makes it much easier for those local capitals and Democratic lawmakers to keep their taxes high because it shields their taxpayers in their states from the full pain of those high taxes because they get to write it off of their federal taxes. And it's really a pity that these 8 Republicans are going here because the SALT deduction, when it was put into the 2017 tax reform, in my mind was one of the crowning achievements of that bill. It was very hard fought because there were Republicans, even then, who come from these high tax states and they didn't want to go there. But it's the right policy to keep that limitation. Look, I'd get rid of it altogether. I think if you did, then you'd really see some pain. And then you'd begin to see some of these taxpayers potentially really putting up a fuss and demanding some change from their own local governors and legislatures. But it's the right tax policy as well because it's essentially a wealth transfer, too. It's, as you mentioned, Kyle, it is a lot of lower earning workers in states out that are not blue transferring federal taxpayer dollars to these guys that live in states and subsidizing essentially bad policy in blue states. And we know how those benefits flow. We were talking about getting rid of the cap, and one estimate said that 57% of the benefit of eliminating that cap would go to the top 1% of earners. So that is the way that the money tumbles in the end. And there's no reasoning with these folks, but they're on the wrong side of policy here.
It's also very geographically concentrated, which I think is fascinating. If you go look at the numbers from the Tax Foundation, for example, before the SALT deduction was capped, the number one locality for SALT deduction was Manhattan, New York County, New York, SALT deduction per filer of $25,600. And below that is some Bay Area counties, Westchester County, New York. Monet, that's what has always been fascinating about this debate over the SALT deduction is it sort of scrambles some of the usual arguments because here you have mostly Democrats in blue states arguing for a tax deduction that goes primarily to the wealthy.
Right. And on the other side of the aisle, you often see Democrats from these same coastal states that are very wealthy arguing to uncap the SALT deduction. You have representatives like New Jersey's Josh Gottheimer who have led the push to do that because a lot of their constituents are very, very wealthy people who are hit by the punitive tax rates that exist in these places. But I think you and Kim are exactly right on the issue that the pressure should be being put on the state houses to reform their taxes as opposed to on the federal government to allow people to deduct the full cost in a way that's only going to encourage more states to increase their tax bills. And I think the interesting thing is that we've already seen the effect of the cap on the state and local tax deduction on state tax policy. We've been talking a lot over the past year about the number of states that have cut their taxes. These tend to be red and purple states. But part of the reason they've done that is because the wealthiest residents of these places were paying much more in their federal taxes because of the $10,000 cap. And so it has been a good incentive for states to get their tax houses in order. In some of these blue states, what we've mostly seen is that they're very unwilling to cut taxes because of the massive cost of government in their states. But I think they also haven't increased their taxes over the past few years nearly as much as they did beforehand. And so the SALT deduction cap has actually had a good effect on tax rates, even in these deep blue coastal states. And so I think it would really be a policy mistake by Republicans to agree to lift that cap or eliminate it.
Kim, last word here, but the trick is that given Speaker Kevin McCarthy's narrow majority, it only takes a handful of these salty dissenters in order to block a bill, a tax bill, if the Republicans bring that to the floor. So where do you think this goes? Do they give in and raise the SALT deduction, given that this is a tax bill that is not going to get through the Senate, and so it's not going to get enacted anyway? Or do they stand their ground and they say, this is bad policy, and get on board? We're passing a Republican tax bill, and we're showing the American people what we want to do if you put us back in charge.
Yeah, I mean, they can't afford to lose more than 5 votes, right? And that's the real pity of this, is that This isn't going to pass the Senate. It's not going to get signed by Joe Biden. It's a messaging bill. And so, why these folks won't get on with the message that Republicans have a plan for how they're going to handle taxes and relieve taxpayers and corporations of tax burdens if they are left in control and win the White House or the Senate is a bit flummoxing. So far, I think the good news is you haven't seen House Ways and Means Committee Chairman Jason Smith back down on this. He has spoken quite passionately about how he doesn't appreciate making his own home state taxpayers funnel money over to help these blue states with their bad tax policy. And Kevin McCarthy doesn't seem to have backed down on it either. The will of most of the Republican Party is certainly to keep that deduction in place. I think the question will be whether or not you can't get a few of these guys with some other provisions or other changes to allow them to agree to come along. So there are 8 right now. Like I said, you can't lose more than 5. Could you negotiate with a few of them, convince a few of them, hey, like, we're going to take care of this other priority you care about, give us this one? We'll see. Some of these guys are more dug in than others, more vocal than others, but this is going to be another one of those things that there's going to be a lot of backroom talks that McCarthy's going to have to engage in.
Thank you, Kim and Monet. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we will be back next week with another edition of Potomac Watch.